from Wurundjeri country on the lands of the Kulin Nation. My name's Joss Nuttal. I'll take a moment to acknowledge country and to introduce myself and to get a bit of a feel for where you're all beaming in from. And then I'll give you a bit of an overview of what I want to cover this morning. Please keep your chat function open because Suzanne will be monitoring that, and if you've got specific questions, I'm happy to respond as we go, or you can save them till the end. I will stop after every 20-25 minutes or so just to allow you to stretch your legs for 5 minutes. This is a long 3 days. I'll also switch my phone off. It's a long 3 days of sitting and listening and concentrating. So, yeah, let's just pace ourselves. So, I'm going to be talking about cultural historical activity theory in the, I guess, in what you might call the Helsinki tradition. I'm going to, I'm just going to pop the, I'm just going to share, make sure that you're getting the correct view. And just while I'm doing that, I'll just say a brief word about readings. I haven't put any prior readings up because I didn't feel I had really a strong enough sense of what the particular needs are of this group. And so I'm going to make some notes as we go along about the kinds of things that I think might be useful for you depending on where you're at. And I will provide a bibliography with some brief annotations, which will include the readings that I make reference to on the slides, but also I'll add in some other bits and pieces as we go along that perhaps respond to your questions. So don't panic if you haven't been able to find the slides or the readings. I will put the slides in the Google Drive as well. So in terms of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to take a pretty wide-ranging and I'd have to say fairly thin view, because being positioned at the start of the summer school like this, or indeed winter school for those of you north of the equator, I wanted to give a kind of introductory feel to this presentation. So my apologies in advance that I'm not going to go deeply into any particular concept. And I'm going to touch really in two parts. The front end is going to be some sort of basic ontological, epistemological principles around chat and anchoring my work within the broad, I guess, family of approaches that derive from Vygotsky's work in particular. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to talk in some fairly pragmatic ways about how those ontological principles and some of those key concepts are actually operationalized methodologically. So, as I say, apologies in advance, it's going to be a fairly fast, loose and wide introduction to cultural historical activity theory. Okay, so with that said, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm a migrant, a recent migrant to Australia. I want to thank elders, past and present, for their ongoing hospitality to me, my family and colleagues who are settlers here in Australia. And I want to acknowledge that the land where I work was never ceded. So I can't see all of you, obviously, but I'm guessing it's not just a case of good morning, that there's some good afternoon and some good evening going on amongst the group. I know we've got folk from, certainly from Australia, New Zealand, kia ora koutou, colleagues across China, Southeast Asia and East Asia. Ni hao, annyeonghaseyo. We've got colleagues from the Americas. Hola. Good evening to all of you. And I'm wondering if perhaps we've also got people from Europe and the UK. I'm not going to attempt the wide range of European greetings, but hello to those of you joining us from the EU and Britain. And to thank John and the team for making this non-travelling summer school available to us. Okay, so here begins the fast and loose. I'm going to talk about cultural historical activity theory, as I say, in the Helsinki tradition, and I'm aware that Yrjö is also presenting at the summer school, which is fantastic. And some of the readings that I will include or recommend to you in the bibliography will be papers from a recent special issue, which Yrjö and I and Nick Hopwood co-edited of the journal Pedagogy, Culture and Society. And that will give you some really, that's a 2021 special issue, and that will give you some really nice up-to-date papers, particularly around the concept of transformative agency, which I'm not going to go into in detail today, but I'll certainly refer you to that material. So if you've done any reading, any background in chat, you'll know something of the historical story, and that mediated action, certainly within chat, is a core concept because of the way artifacts and ideas, which indeed in some respects are also artifacts, and no, we're not having that conversation again, John, become mobilised within the relationship between subjects, between people, and the ends to which they put their efforts. And this was, you know, it's often represented in this very, you know, kind of simple way, subject-object tool relationship. But really, the critical contribution, or one of the many critical contributions that Vygotsky made and his colleagues, was to, and this was in response to, you know, Vygotsky's frustration with psychology at the time, this idea that somehow there was a direct relationship between and action, and therefore you could change what people do by somehow changing their psychological structures, but the explanation for how those structures might change were pretty unconvincing, I guess. It's worth noting that Dewey was struggling with the same question at the time, the stimulus arc problem. So the work of people like William James, Charles Sanders Peirce also has to be touched on here. So this idea that we couldn't understand the development and the learning of individuals without also paying attention to the cultural means through which that learning and development was fostered, whether that be language, which Vygotsky called the tool of tools, but also understanding that individuals, that artifacts are made by people. It's not just that people make artifacts. And what that means was a really powerful idea, and for me remains a powerful idea in understanding, in my case, the world of work, that we can change ourselves from the outside. And we can change ourselves, our psychological structures, our everyday practices from the outside by changing the cultural tools, the artifacts, the media that we use to go about that work. And this was a really profound idea. And I'm really sorry, but there's whippersnippering going on. Somebody's cutting grass outside my window. So David, I can see you on the screen. Put your hand up if you can hear the whippersnipper. You can't. Oh, that's good. That's good news. Okay.
Can't hear it at all.
Thank you, John. Unfortunately, I can, and it's really loud. Okay, so how then do we make sense of the world? And one of the things that we get in a tangle about, and I say we because I include myself, once we delve into this kind of cultural historical space, is, what do we call it? Is it activity theory? Is it cultural historical theory? Is it cultural historical activity theory? Is it socio-historical theory? Is it historical materialist theory? There are subtle differences and important differences between each of these, I guess, what we would call family of approaches, but there are some core commitments that they all share. I guess I should have said right at the start, I shouldn't take this for granted, but everything I have to say today is, up for debate. It's all contestable. So if you think that I'm kind of delivering truths handed down from the hand of God this morning, you're in the wrong lecture. So just please ask questions, contest ideas as we go along. So although in my own work I often invoke Marx, of course Marx was also working in an intellectual tradition. He was the inheritor of the work of early philosophers like Feuerbach and Hegel and so on. The turning point within Marx was this idea of the way that cultural institutions exist in order to maintain collective economic activity under capitalism. When I talk a bit later on about my own work, I'll talk a little bit about why do I work in the CHAT tradition. I'm an early childhood person. I work in the Institute for Learning Sciences and Teacher Education, which is a research institute in our university. Why do I study work? Why do I study childcare educators in particular? So this idea that childcare centres or schools, for example, don't just exist because somebody has to look after the kids or because they're an efficient way to educate large numbers of children. These are an outgrowth of collective economic activity within a particular economic frame, which is capitalism. The second principle is around the distinction between materialism and idealism, and I'll come back to in a little bit more detail what that means. But that idea of the thingness of the world. Now, I'm not saying I've gone off into a kind of post-humanist, even my coffee cup has agency view of the world. I draw the line at that. But the idea that the world is somehow made out of our minds, I don't know, through some sort of incorporeal process, has never been convincing for me. The idea of dialectical method and dialectical psychology, a dialectical materialist worldview, again, I'll touch a little bit more on this shortly. But I really want to emphasise, and this is an aspect of CHAT that's often neglected, as the H, the historical in CHAT, and that the contradictions that we experience within our experience of the world, whether it be at work, in schooling, in our relationships, these aren't either new or unique to us, that these are historically accumulating. And so the dialectical relationship isn't just a contemporaneous relationship between the thingness of now and something else that's now. These are contradictions between now and what we understand to be the past. But how do we raise consciousness of the past if we weren't there? How does that happen? It's because these contradictions persist within the cultural forms of the world around us. And I remember a lovely image, I think it's actually in one of his books, but an image that I saw Michael Cole share of a Sumerian, an ancient Sumerian classroom that had the seats for the children lined up in rows and a desk for the teacher at the front. So, the idea that the classroom is somehow an artifact of the Victorian era, with students sitting neatly in rows, is not actually correct. Okay, and finally, making sense of history. In a sense, there is no history because it's all now. And I'm not going to get into a kind of a philosophical or delve into physics regarding the nature of time and the past. I have one of my children just finished a double degree in philosophy and pure mathematics, and I have way too many of these conversations already. So I'm just going to move quickly over the idea that history remains in the present through the material effects that we experience now, whether that be the effects of class, patriarchy. So these are concepts. Patriarchy is a concept, but it's also a set of practices that have material effects for women and for men, for people of all genders in the present. And so sense making is very much about understanding these historical forms and traces and how they persist today. Okay, I'm citing Bonnie Nardi's work here, really because I just really like Bonnie Nardi's work, but I don't have a deeper grasp of this. Although Leontiev proposes this idea of activity as a unit of analysis within activity theory, Leontiev's conceptualization of activity is quite contested, and I'd point you to Andy Blunden's work in particular around understanding how Leontiev conceptualizes the nature of activity. One of the important ideas, though, from Leontiev is this idea of the collective subject, that when we look at the workplace, in my case, because I study work in early childhood centres, we're always talking about a collective subject. That doesn't mean the individual doesn't exist or that individuals don't learn, but it is the collective subject that is together engaged in what Viv Ellis has called objects of desire. So what is it that these people desire? What is it that they want? What is it that they're trying to achieve in the workplace? And I'm going to talk about some of the methods for getting at that later in the presentation. So objects aren't neutral. The objects of our activity are always infused with emotions, with desires. Leontiev said, quoting Leontiev, he says that the object is the true motive of human activity. And that's a very powerful idea, that it's that which we desire that draws forward our learning and our development. Okay. So this idea of the relationship between activity theory and work, activity theory and cultural historical activity theory, I've actually used and am using in a paper at the moment around datification in early childhood teachers' work. Leontiev's ideas around operations, actions and activities. I've got to say, I'm writing the paper because I'm testing for myself the utility of these ideas in analyses of work. And I've got to say, I'm not that excited about it. So although I'm doing this kind of didactic thing and saying, well, this is how Leontiev describes activity in the context of work, these are ideas that I'm contesting at the moment. This idea of a hierarchical framework of activity. I think it's quite useful if you're talking about something like learning to drive, something that's kind of easily observable, quite sort of structured. Yeah, I'm less convinced about how it applies to collective work. And I can take that point up more in question time if you wish, but that's what I'm sitting with that at the moment. But I think I like what Gonzalez, Nadia and Mark say about this idea of encompassing the motives, the conscious goals, and the actual conditions faced by people as they go about their work. In a sense, that encapsulates the kind of work I do, except that I would add to that ideas about development and learning. How do people change in their practical and psychological activity as they go about their work? And ergo, how then can teacher educators, professional developers foster that change in productive ways? So, you know, I've tried to not have too many triangles in this presentation, but welcome to Triangle World. Those of you who've got any familiarity with CHAT will be familiar with the triangle. There are a great many misconceptions about the triangle. I'll give you a couple just for starters. First of all, the idea that these nodes or points on the triangle are fixed. They move around. Rules become objects. Tools become objects. Sometimes the people become the object, and that can be a little bit, problematic. Contradictions exist within and between every part of the system. That's the nature of human existence. It is contradictory, and contradictions are essential because without any systemic tensions, the workplace is never going to change. So when I go, you know, when I'm working with a group of teachers and they say, oh, actually, we're pretty happy, you know, things are going pretty well, you know, our centre's got a good assessment, and I go, oh, this is going to be a tough one because it means I'm going to have to do quite a bit of extra work to surface the contradictions that are inevitably present in the work. The other thing is, and this is my mistake, I've shown this kind of teleological, even causal relationship. You know, people work on objects which result in outcomes. It actually doesn't work like that. It's a lot more complicated than that. If you've seen, for example, the diagram that Uriah uses in his 1987 book with the, you know, the triangle with the arrows going in all directions, everything mediates everything else in these systemic analyses. And so there's a triangle between subject, tool, and object. There's a triangle between rules, tools, and division of labour. There's also a triangle between rules, subject, and community. There's also a triangle between tools, community, and object. But there's also a triangle between object, tools, and community. So everything's mediating everything else, and things move around. Just a final point about contradictions, and I'm not going to talk about change laboratory today. I use change laboratory as a method. I'm happy to share material that I've written and that others have written about change laboratory, but it's beyond the scope of what I'm doing today. And actually I would suggest is beyond the scope of doctoral work as well, because you need a team of 4 people to do it, ideally. You can have, in workplaces, the most persistent contradictions are usually between the rules and the division of labour. So rules are about how we do things around here, about the values, about the norms of the workplace. And the division of labour is about how we organise ourselves and who does what and when. And very often there's inconsistency between how we say we do things and how we actually do things. But the solution to a contradiction between rules and division of labour is very often not down here. Very often it's in the tools that are being used to organise the relationship between rules and division of labour. Sometimes it's the object that's problematic because what people are working on isn't aligned with, it can actually be causing tensions or disruptions here. And so sometimes the division of labour has to be a temporary object. Let's think about how we organise ourselves so that it's more consistent with our values and desired norms. Or sometimes we have to change the rules so they become a temporary object. But sometimes we actually have to rethink what it is we think we're doing as well. What are we actually working on? And these are the kinds of pragmatic problems that are grappled with in change laboratory. I'm just going to pause for kind of 3 to 5 minutes just to let you stretch, freshen your glass of water. Suzanne, have we got any questions in the chat to... Oh, gosh. All right. Okay. Oh, John. Leontiev mean by desire? Yeah. All I can say about David's point is I agree. Yeah, meaningful object. Desire stands behind objects as if it were hidden. Okay. All righty. Okay, I can come back to those points. All right, let's have a stretch. I certainly need a stretch.
Okay, we will come back at the 10:33, so 5 minutes of stretch.
Okay, and I'll leave you my shelfie to look at.
I really love you. Love is stronger than pride.
David, I'm not going to make it to Seoul next month. Can't get a visa.
Oh
So
no, is this nothing to do with COVID?
Yeah, it's entirely to do with COVID.
Oh,
It's because the Australian borders are closed, are still, well, they're not closed, but there's no visa-free entry for Koreans. The visa waiver has been suspended. So Korea won't open up short-term visas for Australians and New Zealanders until Australia and New Zealand do the same. So if I lived in the US or the UK, I'd be on a plane tomorrow, but I don't. So
no. I've got somebody I want you to meet. I mean, actually, I've got a lot of people I want you to meet, but I met this one yesterday who's doing something on early education educators in Chuncheon. And she's doing a PhD at the University of Regina. And she's got some pretty good data. Also, Dr. Han, who's just got her PhD last month, has done some really wonderful work on, well, initially she called them slow learners, and I convinced her to call them critical learners, meaning in a crisis. They're having a crisis.
yeah, nice.
They were originally called
Yeah,
slow.
no, I'd love to. David, I'll definitely be coming in semester 2 because I'll be coming on a work visa.
Super.
But I couldn't come on a student visa unless I enrolled for 6 months, and that was very tempting. But no. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to press on. I just want to. I've been cogitating in the break on David's point about the relationship between signs and objects, or signs and the various components. And I made the sort of rushed, rather flippant point that I agree totally with David without actually explaining what I'm talking about. When I'm going to jump to a methodological point, and then I'm going to, in order to come back to David's point, because I do agree entirely. When as a researcher, I'm looking at change across time. The thing that I'm looking for more than anything else are changes in the meanings of tools, objects, rules, whatever aspect, but cultural tools in particular. Because cultural tools are embedded with the meanings that we attribute to them. And so it's not possible for a tool to exist without some prior signs that we can populate those tools with. Sorry to end with a preposition there. And so really, it's not about changes in the tools, it's about transformation is about changes in the meanings of the tools, as well as, what can we do with the tools? How do we use them in different and more expansive ways? So meaning is a property of signs, and tools are representative of meanings. So objects don't precede systems of signs, and they certainly don't precede meaning. They are made out of meanings, and those meanings change, and there becomes a dynamic relationship. In part because we're all born into pre-existing systems of signs and tools and meanings. No, John, I don't think there's anything more mystical about desire. And I'm not sure that Leontiev actually talked about desire. He talked about the true motive. And yes, Michael, the meaningful object that Leontiev talks about in activity and consciousness is, so object is not a thing. An object is the motive force for human activity. It is instantiated through material and observable means, but it's closer to the meaning of objective rather than an object as a thing, although objective isn't quite the right term either. Objectives are a bit more short term. David, did you want to add anything there or correct anything? That's my understanding and interpretation.
Yeah, I think that actually Bonnie Nardi said it. She said that object is really objective. And she doesn't pose the interesting question of whether subject is then really subjective. She doesn't say that. But I think that's one possible interpretation, one possible way out of this problem, that to de-thingify the object. But it again raises the problem of why do we think that needs are somehow hidden behind objects when in fact they're, they're right out there in the open. To take your coffee cup as an example.
Yeah.
The need for coffee is right there.
Yeah, and I actually don't think they're hidden. I think that objects are, they're made of these desires, sometimes it's a desire for a change in meaning. I just want to touch briefly on your point about the subject. This is work that colleagues and I are doing at the moment to try and pay, and I should have said this right at the start, cultural historical activity theory in its instantiation within which I work is only about 30 years old, 30, 40 years old. So there's still a lot of gaps in the theory and a lot of work to be done to address the theory itself is an historically accumulating artifact, and so work continues to be done to expand its meanings. And one of the things that I and my colleagues are working on at the moment is to try and understand the nature of the subject, the nature of subjectivity within chat. This kind of gets brushed off as well, the collective is made up of individuals. What happens though, and this is a real workplace scenario, when one person becomes the thing to be worked on by the collective subject. That's not unusual. How do we make sense of the fact that teacher educators as a collective subject may be working on students as the object? So where are the people in all of this? And their desires, their motives, their emotions, how are they made sense of? These are questions, these are empirical, theoretical, ontological, epistemological matters that we keep working on. I certainly don't have the answers for all of these, but I'm having fun having a go at it. All right. Thanks, David. So moving on. I've talked briefly about contradictions. Lenkov talks of them as mutually exclusive opposites. Within chat, they're thought about in terms of systemic discrepancies within social systems. And I've given you the example of when how we organise the work doesn't actually line up with how we say we organise the work or our values in terms of the work. The important point is that contradictions are not conflicts in the sort of traditional Aristotelian dialogic sense. The contradictions represent a dialectical relationship, a kind of tension that is full of possibilities for development, sometimes called growth buds. They're not even necessarily problems to be solved. They're not necessarily, things that have gone wrong. But what they probably are doing is hindering the achievement of the shared objects of the workplace activity. And I'm going to talk about workplaces because that's the context I know best. This is from a paper that I'll include in the set of readings that I wrote with Mari Brennan a number of years ago. One of the things we did in the paper, and it's not a paper about dialectical materialism. This is from the theory section, but we touched on 3 important assertions within a dialectical materialist ontology. So this is part of my quick and broad introduction to some key concepts. First of all, the one I've already talked about, that present forms of activity arise out of historical forms of activity, but circumstances change around us. What is the relationship, for example, between the kind of online learning that was happening pre-COVID and the online learning that's been happening, online teaching and learning that's been happening as a consequence of the changed circumstances brought about by COVID? So we're not contrasting the fact that kids used to go to school and now they do classes at home on the iPad. What's the relationship between how online learning was already done and how it's being done now? The second point is this idea of interdependence between thought and action. I always get a bit nervous when, for example, if my doctoral students talk about ideas of, that somehow people's thinking influences their action or causes their action. When actually it's more dynamic than that. We're talking about interdependent and dynamic relationships between thinking and action, rather than a kind of teleological or causal relationship. And this is a particular bête noire of mine, a particular frustration, because teacher education generally, which is my field, is generally founded on the assumption that if you get a bunch of students, pre-service teachers in the classroom, and you front load them with a whole lot of ideas, they will then go out into the classroom and somehow magically convert those ideas into a set of classroom practices. And we try and help them do that by maybe giving them some examples, maybe show them some videos. We build in some reflective practice so that there's a kind of, loop between their thinking and acting. The evidence for that as a successful approach to people learning to teach is not strong. And I could wax on about that for the time that I have left, and I won't. But it is a persistent problem in teacher education, this idea of, the theory-practice divide. It will not die. Many of us have taken it out into the backyard and tried to kill it, but it persists. It's the zombie of teacher education theorising. Okay, and the realist ontology of dialectical materialism, and therefore of chat, this idea that the world exists outside of us. And so we are born into a pre-existing material world. And so how we experience it is through our experience of the material. And so our experience of the world is what develops as psychological phenomena. So it goes back to this idea that if we change the world around us, we can change our psychological processes. Another bête noire, please ask Gary about this afternoon. Sorry, no. Is this idea that there are somehow 3 generations of activity theory. I just want to, I don't agree with this, and I want to knock it on the head here. And, there's not that I haven't discussed this with Uriah. But this is his description of the 3 generations, and and then you get stuff that talks about 4 generations, and I wanted to touch on it here because it's really confusing for doctoral students and early career researchers when really we're talking about a family of related ideas that are unified around some core epistemological and ontological principles. And it makes it sound like nobody's working, you know, it's like we've moved on, you know, that nobody's working in the tradition of the first one, you know, Vygotsky's cultural historical theory. That's ridiculous. You know, clearly there's an enormous amount of work being done that works directly with Vygotsky's ideas, not least of which, you know, David's work on pedology. The work in the tradition of Leontiev's theorizing is, you know, legion. This work continues. CHAT hasn't displaced generationally these so the idea of generations I find problematic. The fact that there are 3 interrelated traditions, I don't find that problematic. That's, you know, absolutely the case. So I prefer instead to think, and this is where I'm going to start moving into a more methodological angle today, to ask, what is the unit of analysis? What is it that these traditions pay attention to? And what is their object of analysis? What are these traditions trying to understand? So we pay attention to the unit in order to understand the object. Now, this is just a basic methodological principle. Vygotsky, as far as I'm aware, didn't use the phrase unit of analysis. I was happy to stand corrected about that, but I've never found it. And so in CHAT, for example, we ask, what is the work? What is the work? What are these people doing? And their object is, what is it that they are working on? They are doing the work to what ends? To what ends? Just going to pause there. Where are we? Yeah, just having a quick catch up on the chat. Okay. Is there any specific question for me in there, Suzanne?
I think there is no specific questions,
Okay.
but Hannah talked about is CHAT the most appropriate to study human work? And I think David already responded to that, responded to that. Yeah. So.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I say something? Just a sec. Actually, I did respond to it. I didn't respond to it very well. I changed the question. So the real question is, are there other ways of studying work besides CHAT? And I turned it into
loads.
Is CHAT good for studying anything else? To which my answer was not so good, because it did develop.
Agreed.
Work.
Agreed.
And I gave some reasons for that. I think actually one of the best reasons is quite visible in what Jost just said. She feels uncomfortable with the generational analysis of CHAT, and the way you phrase it, Jost, is to say that Engström's supposition is that these generations displace each other, that each generation
No.
murders
I'm sorry
the previous one.
No,
but in fact, what you're looking at is the inability of CHAT to describe its own development very well, and it's because CHAT has pretty much jettisoned the distinction between learning and development and replaced it with something called expansive learning, which is a big mistake.
Okay, I'm going to take you to task there, David, because you're putting words in my mouth. I didn't say that Engström said that these generations displace each other. He most clearly does not say that. My point is that when doctoral students come to this articulation of this idea of generations, it is often misrecognized in that way, that somehow, you know, cultural historical theory has moved on. So that's the first point I will make, that is absolutely not what Engström says. And he's talking about it in terms of the temporal succession of the work. Vygotsky was working in a particular epoch, followed by Leontiev, followed by Helsinki researchers, but it's not about, he makes no claims about displacement. The other thing is that the work on expansive learning has really moved on. I think Annalise's work around transformative agency I find much more persuasive, or transformative agency in the context of expansive learning. Because I use Change Laboratory, I'm deeply familiar with concepts of expansive learning, and I've always had the question, how is this different, other than in some methodological points, from what Dewey has to say about reflection? How is it different from Lewin's work and subsequent, action research work? And I find the concept of transformative agency a lot more persuasive, because it anchors it anchors the orientation of chat very much around practice. And you would have seen that the title of my presentation today was about change in professional practice. I think chat's really useful for understanding change in professional practice. Other things, not so much. And I'm going to touch on this in the methodological section, because chat is often used descriptively, and it has some maybe utility around that, but it's pretty limited. It is a way of understanding collective work. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean collective paid work. You could understand how book clubs operate using chat. Yeah, I think, your point, David, that we really see a clear distinction between learning and development in chat. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think that's work to be done. Expansive learning. Oh, I see where you're coming from. Adults who are all developed already. Yeah. Well, I don't think it's about the development of the person so much as it's the development of the work. I think that's where the slippage is. Yeah. Okay.
And Mikhail also asked how to identify primary contradictions.
Okay. Mikhail, is that question conceptual, or is it a question? Oh, you're talking about use value and exchange value. Okay. Well, there aren't necessarily. Okay. All right. Okay, so Mikhail, your question about exploring and locating primary contradictions in every node. There aren't necessarily primary contradictions in every node. Primary contradictions, are where one rule contradicts another, for example, or where one aspect of the division of labour contradicts another aspect of the division of labour. But they don't necessarily exist in every node. The other thing is, it's not just about use value and exchange value. Methodologically, it's usually done through, fairly traditional ethnographic methods, asking people, watching how they work, looking at the kinds of artifacts that they generate. In Change Laboratory, after introducing the idea of or the concept of contradictions, we send the participants away and ask them, before they come back to the second Change Laboratory, to note down on a piece of paper or in a notebook every contradiction, primary, secondary, tertiary, that they spot in their work. And I work with directors and leaders in childcare centres mainly at the moment. They come back with pages and pages and pages. And they don't have trouble spotting contradictions in their work. That said, something that's always fascinated me and I'd like to write about and it's unfortunately a bit far low down on the list, is the way that contradictions are also embodied within the subject, both the collective subject and the individual subject. And this is now straying kind of well away from the chat tradition. And this is about conversations between theories. But what I've noticed in my Change Lab work and in my research data is that contradictions are often identified. The first point of identification is in the gut feeling of the people. Something's not working here. Something's causing me stress. Something's not quite right. And so work has to be done to identify where are the points of tension that are leading to, you know, and this takes me into, you know, Merleau-Ponty's work on precognition, for example. I'm not so crazy about the idea of tacit understandings, but I'm going to stop addressing your question now, Mikhail. I don't think I've done a very good job of it. I'm happy to come back to it, but I need to move on. Okay, so this goes to the point that I've just been making, that for me, chat is a theory of practice, And if you read David Niccolini's work, for example, I really recommend his work on organisational systems. He would not claim to be a chat researcher, but he has certainly articulated chat as a theory of practice. Then what is it about chat that makes it a theory of practice? And so this idea of understanding the relationship between stabilisation and dynamism that Tara Fennick and her colleagues write about, how some practices become durable, but also the way, you know, they call contradictions disordering elements. One of the things that fascinates me is how these disordering elements can persist for so long. Poverty, racism, I'll just throw a couple in there for starters. So chat research isn't for the faint-hearted in terms of, you know, its methodologies of understanding these multi-directional dynamic relationships. You have to be able to think in 3D. This is why the flat diagram really annoys me. The other thing, I haven't even touched on this at all, what happens when systems connect with each other? Often contradictions that occur within, say, schools or early childhood centres are because of cultural tools that have been parachuted in from other systems, very often from policy systems. And again, going to David's point about learning and development, how do we theorise change within chat? How do we theorise learning and development within chat? And this is work that is still happening, but certainly I think Annalise's work in transformative agency has some promise in the context of researching work. So I've put in red, you know, how do we also make sense of power? Because this is another gap, and Uri's talked about this himself, you know, years ago, that a gap in chat research is to understand the dynamics of power. And so I've got some suggestions about how you might go about that. And I put them in red to remind myself to come back to them. So again, drawing on Bonnie Nardi, broad methodological principles, a long research time frame so that you can see changes over time, looking at broad patterns of activity rather than specific episodes. Episodes may become emblematic of those broad patterns, but what you're trying to understand is the overall direction. What is the meaning and the direction of collective activity? Varied data sets, and I've talked already about some sort of basic ethnographic methods, and then this commitment that's also broadly found in qualitative research at understanding the etic perspective of the work, understanding the world from users' points of views, so that researchers' understandings aren't privileged over those of the participants. So thinking about chat, oh, sorry, David, were you unmuted? Sorry. How are we going? Any other questions or comments?
Nikolai asked about the criteria for contradiction, but you mentioned that you are coming back to that question, so maybe we can wait, and so that we can further look at the concept of primary contradictions later.
And Nikolai, you just need to buy me a cup of coffee and we can talk about it for an hour, but Nikolai's just down the road from me.
Whatever you like, Jos. Coffee,
Yeah.
liters of coffee and gallons of champagne.
It'd be
No problem.
lovely to see you. I'm missing you.
Uh,
Okay, so
well, Jos, my question was quite simple.
please.
Well, every time we speak about contradiction, so we are speaking a lot about contradictions, but the point is that there are contradictions and contradictions. There are
Yes,
some contradictions which are superficial contradictions,
Yes.
but there are contradictions which are dialectical contradictions, and dialectical contradictions are the real source of development. Not
Yes.
every contradiction, only dialectical contradiction is the source of development. And these contradictions are related to dialectical opposites. So, and my question was about the criteria. What is the criteria of distinguishing between these two types of contradictions? I think this is a critical and very important question, which might help our PhD students to get into the idea of contradiction deeply, and this will help them to build their research. If we can help them to understand what is the basic dialectical contradiction. So that's okay. That was my question.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you.
No, don't apologize, Nikolai. It's a really important question, and I suspect as sitting with others in the group. I'll give you my quick answer because I'm skimming here and I don't have much time, but first of all, to say I agree that there are many contradictions in workplaces which are not dialectical. And I'm not interested in doing this kind of work to help people organize themselves better. You want to do that, get a consultant to, come and help you do a mapping, a workplace mapping. Use the triangle by all means. I'm not interested in that kind of work. So for me, the critical criterion for a dialectical contradiction is that it is one that provides the springboard for development, which I think, Nikolai, is what you were saying. And so when working methodologically in change laboratory, and, when they that the participants come back with pages and pages and pages of contradictions. They do, and they're all contradictions, but it's only the dialectical contradictions that are worth working on. And often, just as an aside, resolving some of those dialectical contradictions often leads to a resolution of those more superficial contradictions as well, but that's just I've noticed.
Mm-hmm.
So it is about how the contradiction provides a, whether we call it, the springboard, the tension, the developing bud, the motive, there's lots of metaphors are used to describe it, because we struggle to describe this thing and I think we struggle to describe it because often it is felt, it is embodied collectively as well as individually, but I haven't been able to find anyone writing about that. So maybe you and I'll have to do that, Nikolai.
Yeah. And also just, well, when we speak about contradictions, we have not to forget about the unity, okay? Because this is the unity of the opposites is the point. I mean, if you think dialectically, I hope David would agree with this. So we have to grab contradictions in their unity. Okay, they are mutually exclusive on one hand, but they create a sort of unity, and this unity is related to the unit of analysis, and therefore I'm very critical Uria's idea, then for Vygotsky, the mediated action was a unit of analysis. It was never a unit of analysis for Vygotsky. At least I didn't find in Vygotsky work anything about the mediated action as a unit of analysis. Well, we need to clear the terminology, and this is the work which should be done in chat, I think. Sorry, I don't want to be so critical. I respect all the theories.
No, and I know you do, and just for the sake of others in the group, Nikolai and I have these conversations all the time, and really enjoy them, because I acknowledge that I'm working in a tradition that itself is riven with contradictions and is not. And so
sometimes even dialectical contradictions.
Yeah, there might even be one or two of those. I need to get it. But there are certainly some historically accumulating tensions, and even this idea of generations would be an example of that. Going back to Sid's point about explaining development and so on. And so I find it really intellectually stimulating, and so really, really frustrating to work in a tradition that still has a lot of holes in it. And yet, why do I do it? Because, not just because it's fun and intellectually challenging, but because there are fundamental and dialectical contradictions in the work. And I'm talking about women. You've heard me rave on about this before. Who are paid almost nothing, and yet suddenly they turn out to be essential workers who are not prioritised for vaccination. Sorry, I'm going to get emotional, so I'll stop. But these go back to core Marxian ideas around the relationship between use value, surplus value, etc., etc. And so I won't, and one of the things that can be both exciting and dangerous in doing change laboratory work with early childhood educators is that it leads them to an awareness of those deep historical dialectical contradictions, and it can be very distressing and demotivating. And it sometimes is in my work as well. Right, I need to move on. So let's take a stretch. Thank you for the question, Nikolai. Let's take a stretch for a few minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Freshen up your glass of water, get a cup of coffee, and we'll come back. Is that okay, Suzanne?
Yes, maybe we can come back at 11:12.
Yeah. Yeah, anyone's welcome to join the conversations between me and Nikolai.
Nikolai, isn't word meaning an example of mediated action? Certainly a unit of analysis.
No. Word meaning is a unit of analysis, but word meaning is not a mediated action, definitely, as you know. So there is a kind of, miscommunication or misunderstanding of the idea of the unit of analysis, okay? Because the unit of analysis is, as you know, is a minimal unit of analysis of something, and mediated action. What is the unity the mediated action is the unit of? Well, molecule is a unit of water, okay. Living cell is a unit of organism, okay. But what is the unity the mediated action is a unit of?
My question is, why isn't word meaning an example of mediated action? Mediated action is extremely broad, extremely general. Everything is mediated, everything's unmediated.
Yeah, but look, I understand your question, of course, and we have a lot of discussions about that. But what I'm saying is that if I see that Uriel says for Vygotsky, unit of analysis was mediated action understood as word meaning, that's okay. But he says mediated action as a unit of analysis.
No, that's
it. That's it. So,
All right.
and mediated action was in the focus of Vygotsky's work in 20s, as you know. In 20s, Vygotsky spent a lot of time working with the mediated actions. That's okay. That's okay. But at later stages, from 30s, he came to the idea of the unit of analysis. Unit of analysis didn't appear in his works in 20s, as you know. So, okay. So when Vygotsky was studying the mediated action, he didn't study the unit of analysis. When he started to use unit of analysis, he didn't study the mediated action. So it's an interesting point, but I don't want to draw too much attention to myself today. We can continue later on if you like. Of course, we will, because I love to talk to you, David, and I miss you a lot.
Next session, we'll talk.
Okay.
Back in action, Suzanne?
Yes, I think we can be back now. We are all back now.
Okay. I'm going to move quite quickly through a worked example, because one of the ways, for me, these are the kinds of conversation that David and Nikolai have been having, is also a driver for empirical investigation. It's, you know, how do we make sense of the concepts by attempting to operationalize them? So the example that I'm using is this is a made-up research question, and I just want to very quickly make a few methodological points. So I've talked about workplace practice as a unit of analysis, and David's absolutely right. That means that everything and nothing is the unit of analysis. The reality is that very often it's focused in around a particular object, and the way that the practices related to that object are mediated by the available artifacts, rules, tools, divisions of labour. In this particular example, it's about the development of leadership in early childhood education. The object of the research is to try and understand the development of leaders. And so this is related to the introduction of the educational leader role in early childhood services in Australia in 2012. Very often early childhood graduates go straight into leadership roles, and they often find that very difficult and challenging. And so some workplaces adapt their practices to support those graduates, and some of them don't. So what are the workplace practices that might support those graduates to be effective leaders of teaching and learning? Complex units need complex, or a complexity of methods, a variety of methods. I'm not saying that you will use all of these, but these are the kinds of methods, certainly, that I use in my own research, to think holistically about these broad units. Practice, ultimately, and I've talked about workplace practices in this context, and by practices, what I mean is culturally typical and enduring collaborative activity. And what meanings are brought to those practices? Analytically, when we go into any research, and I don't only work in the qualitative tradition, although mainly I do, we take, we already have rich meanings for the phenomenon that we're trying to explore. And the idea that you can somehow put your meanings aside, or the idea that you know, if you work in a school, that somehow, if you do research in that school, then your analyses will somehow be contaminated or biased. God help us, please never use the word bias in a qualitative thesis. Really, it's about being conscious, or as conscious as you're able to be, about the concepts that you inevitably, the concepts, the meanings that you take into the field. And these come from the research question, they come from your literature review, and they come from your background theory. So in this case, in the research question, already there are concepts of leadership and qualifications and roles and affordance and constraint. If I go to the literature on new graduates working in leadership roles, I'll find concepts of apprenticeship and transition and practice shock and power. And of course, I'm using chat, so I'll find concepts of division of labour and rules. So I already have a rich repertoire before I've even recruited my participants. And so, say I've interviewed 3 teachers, I already have all of these concepts, which are, I may even use them to help construct some of my interview questions, taking care not to lead the participants to give the answers that I already think they should be giving. And so this kind of raw data grid is a way of doing an initial analysis of what the teachers have to say in relation to each of those prior concepts. But then there's this sort of mystical process of, or it's often presented as mystical, because generally speaking, researchers in education, in my experience, and I've edited books, I've edited journals, so I think I say this with a little bit of authority, are often really rubbish at explaining their inductive strategies. You know, they say things like the data were coded, or themes emerged, God help us, never say themes emerged, because that makes them sound like magic. These are concepts that are actively generated, created by researchers using specific analytic strategies. It's not just about reading, you know, people say you've got to be immersed in your data. Sorry, I'm sounding a bit sarcastic, but, you know, become really familiar with your data and somehow you'll figure out what it all means. No, there are specific analytic strategies that we use. I'm having a sort of quasi-scientific moment here, but I'll let that pass. So language in use, and you know, the whole conversation that we've been having so far, we keep coming back to this idea of meaning, signs, of how we populate cultural tools, concepts. And so how people use language is one of the most useful analytic strategies for making sense inductively of data and chat research. And all of these traditions, the idea of, you know, conversation analysis, where you're looking for spontaneous moves or turning points, there's a literature on each of these. Discourse analysis, you can do worse than just, these are basic questions that Carla Willig proposes. What are they talking about? What else are they talking about? What are they not talking about? How is meaning circulating amongst the group? If you're doing teacher education research, you've probably come across the work of Conley and Clendenin and their work on narrative analysis. And these inductive concepts of where you can use, you know, plot, characters, temporality, and so on, critical incidents to make sense of narratives. Because I can't see my slides. Sorry, what does my slide say?
It's about what characteristics chat analyzes, and then some examples.
Yeah, all right. So, rich descriptions of practice and what's motivating that practice. How cultural tools come into play in the work. Where are the contradictions? And going to Nikolai's point, the contradictions that provide a springboard for development. Accounts of change, whether that's expansion in the sense of Engstrom's work, which relates to deeper and more complex meanings of objects, or whether it's transformation of practices enabled by and related to in a dialectical relationship, not enabled by, in a dialectical relationship with changes in meaning. And he also talks about reconcretization of practices, and this goes to my point about teacher education, that we expect teacher education students to be able to take the kinds of abstract descriptions that we've given them, abstract concepts in the university courses, and concretize those in the classroom, which is not a particularly reliable strategy. Working from concrete practices to then abstract insights from those and then reconcretize practices in new ways is the cornerstone of change laboratory work. And if you're familiar with Annalisa Sonnino's work, you'll know the way that you'll be familiar with this idea of transformative agency and the idea of volitional action, of doing rather than being done to. This idea of being an active player in our own development. That development is not something that's done to us. It's not something that arises spontaneously through some kind of mystical process somewhere behind the pituitary gland or wherever. That we are in an active relationship with our world and with our own development. So I've said, you know, change laboratory is not really, that's a big call, saying change laboratory is not an ideal methodology for a doctorate, but certainly there are plenty of people who are using CHAT to provide descriptive analyses of work, to understand what people are working on, where the works come from, the meanings that are expressed in relation to tools and artifacts, what's confounding the work, its relationship to other systems, the roles of values and norms, what's being learned. I'm looking at this list now. I wrote this list a while ago and I'm thinking, I don't feel very excited by this list. I don't feel very, you know, it's interesting. And to change a thing, you have to describe it. But there's plenty of there's a lot of descriptive work about workplaces. Something that I think isn't well understood or well taught in doctoral supervision, Nikolai, we need to make a note of this, in our quest for better doctoral supervision, is the construction of focal claims and the creation of focal theory arising from interrogation of a particular research question. That when we write about findings in our research, the findings are not simply on the basis of data, that robust findings demand a synthesis between the background theory, CHAT in this case, the substantive literature, whether it be early childhood leadership or whatever, and the data to hand. And that the process of generating the focal theory or the thesis of the thesis, and I've made it look very smooth and very linear when actually it's very messy and recursive, but I just couldn't put that many circular arrows on the diagram. That this process of moving from raw data through analysis to the creation of analytic claims and ultimately focal theory, many doctoral theses stop here at categorization. Some of them stop here. But no real testable and contestable thesis or theory is offered. And so I'd really encourage you to think about the whole sequence, that it's not enough to summarize and describe what you found, not in a doctoral thesis. And I think this is my last slide. I think it is my last slide. Yes, it is my last slide. I've been playing with this idea of, or this challenge that I put in red. How do we think about power? And people who want to talk about power, you know, they suddenly jump ship and go all Foucauldian and start talking about the power knowledge nexus. And when actually, if we're interested in responding to oppression, if we're interested in responding to, and you know, in my work, why childcare educators are treated with such disdain by governments and the community, and indeed to some extent by each other through these internalised meanings about their work, then we have to be asking questions. When we do analyses of workplace activity, we need to also be asking questions about power. And I hope that I've done some work around the ethics of change laboratory and the problematic ethics of change laboratory, and where I'd like to get to. And then again, this is a paper that's down the list somewhere, is thinking about how power is instantiated and how we make sense of it in the chat tradition, if at all. Because one of the, and I've written about this in other places, but one of the dangers of locating chat within the organisational systems tradition, which is where it often appears, is that it becomes another, I was going to say another evil tool of the patriarchy. It becomes another modality for the pursuit of oppressive ends. You know, it becomes another way, or change laboratory becomes another way of getting people to do what their bosses want them to do in the interests of the bosses. And I'm putting that in a really crude sense, but I think we have to think about the change laboratory itself as a site of power relations and how power is circulating, and not just power over people, power with and for people. So I've taken my previous list of questions from a sort of basic descriptive chat analysis, and then asked some additional questions about how we might look at those responses and think about power. It's not enough to think about what's being learned and who's doing the learning, but who says what learning is important, what learning is valued? How is work governed? I've got plenty of examples in my own work of where groups of teachers design workplace changes and then find themselves constrained because of forms of governance within their school or their early childhood centre, or indeed, you know, imposed by their employers outside of the centre. And so I think it's important to be able to document those things as well and understand activity systems as open and permeable and not some kind of closed heuristic for the sake of our research. So I'm going to stop there, Suzanne. Hongxi?
Yes, thank you so much, Joss, for your wonderful presentation, and also thank you all for the wonderful and insightful discussions. So we are actually running out of time, but we have one last question from Darcy, and then we can go for our lunch. while you are having your lunch, you are welcome to take your plate and come to the Wonder Room and having your lunch and chat with each other. So now, Joss, would you like to respond to Darcy's question about what is a traveling artifact?
Hi, Darcy. How are you? Thanks for your question. Good to see you here.
I'm very good, thank you. And just wanted to say the talk you gave last year and the whole chat summer school last year has seriously influenced my PhD over the last year. So I was really looking forward to this one again. But yes, what is a travelling artifact?
Oh, kia ora. I'm pleased to hear that. In a good way, I hope.
Yeah.
There are, once you get into the chat literature, Darcy, you will know as well as I do, there's a whole range of concepts that have been, explanatory concepts that have been introduced into that literature. Boundary objects would be another related example. I understand travelling artefacts to be artefacts that move from system to system.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, classic example would be something like a curriculum framework. In the context of your work, it might be a set of regulations around, you know, the implementation of the kind of work that you do, but it's come from a another system.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very good. That's pretty much what I thought it was.
Yeah.
So thank you.
And those artifacts often introduce, you know, contradictions as well, or stimulate, or expose existing contradictions.
Yeah, I was thinking of an artifact or tool that's produced in an instrument producing activity system, such as as you say, a new student management system or something like that comes into your central activity system and causes major disruption because it highlights a whole lot of existing contradictions.
A really good example in the university system is the introduction of things like the PBRF in New Zealand and the ERA, Education Research for Australia, you know, as performance metrics in university research. They've just completely disrupted and indeed almost overturned university systems. Yeah.
Yep.
Highly disruptive. Apologise,
Sorry,
we've actually got 30 more minutes.
Yeah, we got 30 more minutes. I made a mistake, so sorry. So anyone else got a question for Joss?
It's fine if you don't.
Josh, I have a kind of reflection or refraction, if you like. Well, this is not the first presentation of you. I'm in the audience, and I really love the way you present. And it seems to me that you take the maximum from the cultural historical activity theory that the theory can suggest. Another story is that CHAT has, as you said, has some holes, and at the moment it doesn't suggest a lot. But I love the way you take the maximum, and what you consider as holes, I consider as a kind of the historical destiny of CHAT, which is coming to simplified versions. So originally it was a strong theory, but now what we have is a simplification of triangles, simplification of mediation, simplification of transformation, simplification of contradiction. Everything is so simplified and Coca-Colaized, so to say, in American way. And
the term I would use, Nikolai, is it's become instrumentalized.
Well, instrumentalized, yeah, it's very neutral, but well, simplification is the process. I don't think the holes should be fixed. I don't think the holes are to be fixed, because holes are they evolve from the beginning. So, and I see that the tendency of the people who started with CHAT, they are coming back to activity theory, they are coming back to Leontiev, they are coming back to Vygotsky, and this is the tendency. I don't know what you think about this, but I just want to know what you think about this. How do you consider this tendency of many people coming back from CHAT back to original Vygotsky's ideas, to cultural historical? For example, Marianne Hedegaard, for example, well, Annalisa Sanina even.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very in Annalisa's work, that recursive move back into Vygotsky in particular.
Yeah, to richness, from simplification.
Not so much Leontiev.
Yeah, to richness. So.
Well, yeah. I'd answer your question with a question. It's a rhetorical question, but is that recursion, is that return to Vygotsky about a kind of reverse engineering, a kind of retrofitting of CHAT, a kind of repair move? Is it about a genuine attempt to critique, modify, expand, enrich the theory?
No.
And I'm not, I'm not taking up a position either way. My experience has been that in some respects, CHAT and Change Laboratory are extremely helpful.
Oh yes, definitely.
Yeah, and
there is no point about that, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
And the reason that I moved to CHAT and to Change Laboratory was because, and Edward summarised this up really nicely in a conversation I had with her years ago, that you get to a certain age where you're not interested in just describing things anymore. You actually want to change stuff.
Yeah.
CHAT and Change Laboratory have provided me with the sufficient conceptual resources and methodological tools to do work that I have been able to show is empirically important in early childhood. Things like leadership and the organisation of work. My real concern, though, is in the doing of that work, how has it helped me to push back against some of those really underlying contradictions that bedevil the field of education, and particularly the field of early childhood education? I'm still thinking about that. I'm still working on that, because we're always working from the general to the particular and back again.
Yeah, that's, thank you very much. And my understanding is that CHAT is based on Vygotsky, and there is no question about that. There is a strong link between Vygotsky's ideas and CHAT, and nobody doubts about that. But when CHAT was created, we had a very limited knowledge about Vygotsky theory. It was a kind of picture of Vygotsky theory created from Mind in Society. Very limited, very narrow. But last 25 years, we have a lot of publications of Vygotsky works which were unknown even for Russian researchers, and now more translations. Now you see how really rich Vygotsky was, comparing to the simplified, abridged version presented in Mind in Society. And therefore, it's now time to come back to Vygotsky to look at Vygotsky's richness, because now we have this richness in our hands because of publications. I call it a new reality with Vygotsky's heritage. And I'm still wondering why people are still quoting, making reference to Mind in Society, despite we have 6 volumes of collected works plus 2 volumes of pedagogical works. So I think that we need to create a kind of new vision of Vygotsky theory, and then we will understand CHAT better then.
Yeah, look, I think you've just given a really beautiful example of how theory develops over time, how it goes off down different tracks to test different ideas. For the sake of the group, I should just point out that there is one aspect of, I'm not saying of theory, but of work in relation to theory where Nikolai and I strongly differ. And that's that Nikolai is, and thank God Nikolai is doing this work because it's so helpful for me, really drilling down into what is it that Vygotsky was, what did he mean? What was he actually trying to do? How do we understand Vygotsky in a more robust way? I'm less concerned about the quest for truth because I'm much less patient than Nikolai and I'm a very pragmatic person. And so for me, it's less about what is the true meaning of the theory and more about when I do this work with these teachers, what changes and is it good for them? Does it enrich their lives? So I have a much more pragmatic take with a small p. But of course, these approaches are in dialogue with each other. There is a dynamic relationship between the development of the theory and the empirical work that's going on in the field. And the more empirical work I do using CHAT, the more I'm aware of its weaknesses and its limitations. That said, show me a theory that explains everything and I'll show you a pig that flies. Now, theories try to make sense of particular phenomena. There is no grand theory. No matter how much we love Vygotsky, there is no grand theory of the world. This is like the quest for, you know, the unified theory of, you know, that scholars in physics, you know, is it string theory? Is it quantum theory? You know, how do we explain the world? There is no unified theory. And so we need to be clear about what our theories are good for and what they're not good for. And I think that CHAT, as in its current instantiation, is good for explaining changes in collective practice in workplaces. I think it's really good for that. There's a whole lot of other stuff it's not good for. For example, it doesn't explain how individuals learn and develop within those collective structures.
So thank you for the interesting discussion. I think Hannah raised her hands up before. Hannah, do you got a question?
Yeah, well, I've got a really basic question. Because I've not focused on CHAT, but rather on social cultural theory in applied linguistics. So that's where my question comes from, and I was wondering what was originally the kind of purpose that, if I understand it correctly, Leontiev kind of started to create CHAT. What was the idea of kind of moving from Vygotsky's theoretical ideas to developing this activity theory? Partly the question was solved, but I think there's still a lot to explain there.
I wouldn't attribute CHAT to Leontiev, but certainly activity.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, Nikolai, I'm going to throw this one to you because you're the activity theory scholar than me. There were, you know, fundamental, what's a polite way to express it, differences, disjunctions in the relationship between Leontiev and Vygotsky.
Well,
yeah, and their work moved. Leontiev went off in a different direction. Do you want to? There's historical and political reasons for that as well, but
just you're right, and thank you, Hannah, for this question. Of course, well, question is very deep, and it requires a lot of time to discuss, because if you look at the Russian literature, they are still discussing the similarities and differences between Leontiev and Vygotsky, and there were a lot of discussions started from 70s. So they are discussing this for almost 50 years, and it will require for me not 50 years, but at least 50 minutes to explain. But the main reason was that they started to work together, and Leontiev was a collaborator of Vygotsky, and then Leontiev moved to Kharkov, to Ukraine, from Moscow, and he started to develop his own approach based on the activity, because activity was never the central category, the central concept for Vygotsky. Vygotsky was speaking about social situation of development, social environment, without focusing on activity. And after moving to Kharkov in beginning of 30s, Leontiev was very critical to Vygotsky, because he said that Vygotsky was not a Marxist, not a materialist, because he neglects the activity, the role of the activity. And he even said that it's not a переживание is a unit of analysis. There is a real activity, which is the unity with the consciousness. And therefore, it was a personal breakthrough between Vygotsky and Leontiev. And we have now published Leontiev's critical papers on criticizing Vygotsky for idealistic understanding of consciousness, as a dialogue of consciousness, as a communication. So it was a historical, ideological, theoretical, and personal aspects of these differences. But on the other hand, what unifies activity theory, Leontiev, and cultural historical theory, Vygotsky, is their understanding of the process of development. They understand development not as a biologically driven process, not as a brain maturation, all these things. They understood development as a social cultural process, social cultural development, where the social environment is the source of development. Social environment as a source of development. So that's the idea which unifies Vygotsky and Leontiev, activity theory and cultural historical. They say that the only way to understand development is to look at social environment as the source of development, how social environment affects individual developmental trajectories. And this makes the unity. But the difference is that social environment for Vygotsky was social situation of development. So social environment for Leontiev was activity. And the slogan of sorry, just one more phrase. The slogan of Leontiev was, what stands behind the consciousness? Activity stands behind the consciousness. That was Leontiev's slogan. And Vygotsky said, dear Alexei Nikolaevich Leontiev, your slogan is great, but my slogan is different. What stands behind the consciousness? Life stands behind the consciousness. And life should not be reduced to activity only. Okay? So, sorry, I didn't promise 50 minutes, but so in 3 minutes I did. But Hannah, if you need more about that, so just contact me or contact Joss or contact David or John, and we are happy to have a discussion about it.
I came to Vygotsky from applied linguistics too. I am like you. And I know that in applied linguistics, there is Swain and there's Landhoff, and there are lots of names that other people here pay no attention to. And what I want to leave you with, Hannah, is that one thing we didn't do in applied linguistics is to ask what and why did this huge split between Leontiev and Vygotsky have to do with word meaning? You think that's an obvious question because you and I are linguists. We're interested in languages. And it turns out that the key issue, yeah, it has to do with life and it has to do with Kharkov and it has to do with all the things that Nikolai's talking about. But the key issue is, what is your unit of analysis for thinking and speech? Now, you think that's the thing that Swain and Landhoff and everybody who's interested in using Vygotsky, applying Vygotsky to applied linguistics, you think that's the main thing we're interested in. And it isn't. It isn't, because Landhoff and Pointer and, Ontario, OISE, and Pennsylvania State University have all latched on to activity theory as their way of understanding Vygotsky. There is another way, and that is Halliday and also pedology. With pedology, we see the development of word meaning as the child develops. And with Halliday, we get something that just kind of leaves out of her talk, that one of the key differences between tools and signs is that signs have grammar. Signs have vocabulary and grammar, at least linguistic signs do. And those are the things that you and we applied linguists, are most interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah, leave it out because I'm not a linguist. So
Great. It's a great point, Dave.
And
Thank you. And also think about переживание as one of the central ideas of cultural historical theory. You will never find.
I'm going to cut you off. I'm going to cut you off there, Nikolai,
Oh.
because you'll have an opportunity to talk about that with the group later. I want to go to Meg's question in the chat, but thank you
Yes.
for that, because you've given us another example of how different theories try to pay attention to different things and try to explain different things. And this goes back to my open statement, that one of the struggles for early career researchers and doctoral researchers is to understand, what do these things have in common and what do they not have in common? And how important are those distinctions? It's all useful and good to know, particularly so that you don't misrecognize the theory, try to make it do things that it can't do. However, the most important thing is this the right theory for the research question that you're asking? What is the relationship between what it is that you want to know and the theory for your, what kind of explanatory and guiding power will the theory have? Meg's asked a question about the relationship between motive and object. And I suspect you don't mention it, Meg, but I'm thinking maybe you're also thinking about the idea of a hierarchy of motives. Yes, in any setting, individuals and collectives have a whole range of things that they're working on simultaneously, and a whole range of things that motivate the work. However, they tend to be in a hierarchy. And so empirically, we often, in change laboratory, often run into what Engstrom calls the double bind, where there are motives that are sitting in tension with each other, that there are contradictions between motives. So, for example, if I own a childcare centre, I might be motivated to pay I might be motivated to offer really high quality care because there are external systems that demand that of me. I might also be motivated to make a profit. And so I pay my staff the minimum wage. Now that's contradictory. There's any amount of evidence, as I'm sure you know, Meg, that you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And so, sorry, that was very disparaging, but I'm getting tired. That if you want high quality programs, then you need to employ top-notch staff, and top-notch staff typically need to be paid well. And so I have to decide, I'm motivated by both quality and profit. Which of those is going to trump the other? What is my hierarchy? And that hierarchy can move around. And of course, I'll be motivated by other things as well. But each of those motives has its own emotional component. Those motives have various meanings for me. And so the idea that there is one motive is a kind of a theoretical heuristic, but in the real world, it's, as you would know, much more complicated than that. You've asked a question about the the conflation of motive and object. Yeah, that is the case in Leontiev's work. He says that the object is the true motive. And so he does conflate the two. But yes, you will find multiple motives across teaching teams. The idea of the common object is usually how that's resolved, as you've pointed out, and the process of change laboratory begins by the identification of a common object. And back to Nikolai's earlier point about, the nature of contradictions. For change and development practice to occur, and I don't talk much about expansive learning these days. I'm interested in practice development. And Seth Chaikin has written about this sort of the various traditions of practice developing research, because Engstrom's not the only person who's been influential in this space. So, for practice to develop, it has to be a dialectical contradiction. It's not enough that they just want to reorganise, that they're motivated for the roster to be more efficient. And so you go, oh, look, there's a problem with the division of labour. That's not necessarily a contradiction that will lead to any development, that'll springboard development. Yes, absolutely, motives compete with each other. You can have, contradictions between, and in fact, the phrase that Leontiev uses is motive, object of activity. So he doesn't talk about motives and he doesn't talk about objects. He talks about motive, object of activity. So it is the object that draws, from a developmental point of view, that draws the practice forward, that opens up possibilities for change, development, expansion, and it gives some direction to the activity. Did that answer your question or just make it more complicated?
I love all this. I love hearing all this. I'm so pleased that John sends out these invitations to join these things, because it's just fabulous to have these rich conversations. No, that was good. And some feedback that I have had back made me think that I may not necessarily I may get criticism if I use motive in the way that I have but there was definitely multiple other things that that were identified by my teaching team. So thank you. No, I appreciate.
Yeah, see, motive gets conflated with motivation, and motivation gets conflated with willpower. And this is a classic example of what Nikolai was saying about the way that CHAT, for example, and look, you could say the same thing about Foucault. There are some key concepts in all kinds of traditions that have been taken up in really superficial ways and really unhelpful ways. And so when you start to read in CHAT, or you start to read in cultural historical theory, or you start to read in post-structuralism or post-humanism, you'll read a lot of work where the writers have not done, the sort of the core work of really deeply understanding the concepts. And so these sort of evacuated concepts, the words keep being used, like motive and object and power and knowledge and so on. Signs, meaning, that the words keep being used, but conceptually they become quite evacuated, and it can be really confusing for doctoral students when these concepts get taken up and used in different ways. And so what I would recommend when you find yourself in that situation is to say, is to tell it like it is, to say that the concept of motive has been taken up in a variety of ways in the cultural historical tradition. For the purposes of this thesis, I am adopting Leontiev's, etc., etc. This is found within the work of who have reported on, which is similar to my study. So it's about making transparent your story of making sense of the concept, of actually showing that you think like a researcher, that you look at the literature and go, God, what a dog's breakfast. I need to be able to anchor myself somewhere within this field and show that I've done the work to try and transcend these superficial understandings. And I look back at my earlier work in particular, and even some of my current work, and think, oh my God, that is so shallow. Like, I'm constantly thinking, I didn't get that right. But we're learning. And so it's really a question of how vulnerable are you prepared to make yourself.
Thank you. That makes perfect sense to me, because I did that very thing to say while I was using the Finnish tradition of cultural historical activity theory. I went to lengths to justify why I was using that approach. So I just need to make it clear why framing around.
It's about critique. It's about being clear about what the theory can't do as well. It's time to finish. Thank you for your engagement throughout, your questions, your comments, your nodding, and I will be in touch. The slides, and I won't get it done today. I've got back-to-back meetings today, but later in the week I'll certainly have a short annotated bibliography and the slides available for you. And I hope you can take some of these questions forward into